So Susan Sontag loved to tell a story. She told a story at Penn, and it was recorded about how she walked into Farrar, Straus and Giroux knowing nobody, plunked the draft of her first novel on the desk, and that eventually Robert Giroux filched it out of the junk pile and called her in for an interview. And Robert Giroux, the famous editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, was in the Penn audience when Sontag told this story. Almost like a
Uh-huh.
fairy tale story being discovered as a writer by
Yep.
this important
Yep.
Robert Giroux.
Yep.
Robert Giroux wrote her a very
Uh-huh.
funny tongue-in-cheek letter that I found in the Farrar Straus archives at the New York Public Library. He said, "Susan, don't you remember that you came in name-dropping, saying you had talked to Jason Epstein and other people, and they all said this was a novel that I should read? I mean, it was nothing like the story."
You're listening to The Way We Live Now, a podcast about thinking globally, acting locally. I hope you'll also subscribe to the newsletter at karenchristensen.substack.com. Now, back to the show. Good morning. I'm Karen Christensen, and I'm talking today to Carl Rollyson. Good morning, Carl.
Good morning, Karen.
Great to talk to you again. And I'm already laughing because this one was inspired by my spotting a book with a blurb that referred to, it was about comparing criticism to biography. And that's not really what we're talking about today, although you're welcome to. But it referred to the imperial banality of biography. And that just made me laugh because I have come, especially through reading you on biography and listening to you, to realize the kind of invaluable service it does, as well as being interesting. But it really does. So anyway, my question to you, so I immediately sent that on to you. Why do we need biography? Isn't it better? I mean, you've dealt with this. I think, I mean, I don't know which was the most dramatic. I remember reading about Rebecca West, Martha Gellhorn, Michael Foote, people who've told their own, Susan Sontag, who told their own stories and they knew it. And who were you to interfere? And you're dealing with that now to some extent?
Sure. That phrase, Janet Malcolm's phrase, imperial banality of biography, is it's funny. It gets at something in biography, which is on the one hand, the biographer's asserting a kind of authority over a life, and that's often what the Susan Sontags and other subjects of mine have resisted. They think of themselves as the authority on their own lives. And the banality part is a kind of snobbish dismissal biographers as second-raters, especially in the realm of literary biography, where the biographer's style is likely to be deemed pedestrian compared to, say, if I write a biography of William Faulkner, it's not going to be Faulkner. It's so there's that, and also banality in terms of the way some people think of biography as a day-by-day enterprise. And so it doesn't have the sort of the heft, the drama, the dynamic that biography does. On the other hand, I think as any historian would tell you, people pick on biography, but you can't have, people say, well, is this an authorized or unauthorized biography? That's nonsense, those terms. It's like, would you have an authorized biography of the French Revolution? Do we just take Robespierre's word for what he did? I mean, it's ridiculous. Of course, there's a place for a biography and biographers. So, on the one hand, imperial banality of biography, I sort of get that. On the other hand, it's so reductive that it leaves no room for what people really gain from not only biographies, but many biographies, especially if it's a subject like someone I'm working on now, Herman Melville, who there have been many Melville biographies. And I'm writing almost what might be called a meta-biography, a biography about biography, because I started thinking about the way Melville's life was described. And for instance, there's the almost surely a suicide, his son Malcolm's suicide, he's Melville
Mhm.
himself finds his son in his room with a pistol and a bullet in his head. And the Melville family resists the verdict that it's suicide. And none of the biographers really talk about that. Number one, he shot himself in the head and nobody heard it. Number two, he shot himself in
Mhm.
the head, and they went almost a whole day till Melville came home from work and knocked on the door and forced his way in to see that his son had committed suicide. When you stop to think about things like that, those are the kind of the holes in biography that biographers tend to
Uh-huh.
elide, to kind of move past, or they don't
Mhm.
ask that question. And so that's what I've been trying to do, is to say not only what biography can tell you, but it can also show you what we don't know and why that's important. Why there's certain things, even about a figure who's been written about many, many times, where the question hasn't even been asked. I've been looking at all the Melville biographies, and no one even raises the question, "How come no one heard that shot?"
And 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 yet the suicide of a child
That too.
is a significant event in someone's life
Yes, and
to
and
pass over it as if it were, not of great significance. But am I right that Lewis Mumford wrote the first biography of Melville?
um, Raymond Weaver wrote the first.
Ah,
Mumford there were a whole cluster of them. Leon Howard is another one in that decade of the 1920s.
uh-huh,
if I
I see.
remember my chronology correctly, I think Weaver was the first.
Mhm, mhm. And, Mumford was drawn to Melville's story for very specific reasons, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
I'll just I can't resist saying
mm,
because Mumford wrote so much about cities and he had such a strong
yeah,
sense of the city, he often projects into Melville what he thinks it was like for Melville, in the city. And
yeah.
it could be, but as I show there are other alternatives to, was it
Mhm,
depressing or was it exhilarating? At what moment are we talking about in Melville's life? The 1860s or before 1830 when he was a child growing up in New York City? And what did he carry with him from that
mm,
childhood when he walked his beat, so to speak, as a customs inspector, which is part of what
mhm.
I'm sort of
Yeah,
inquiring
yes,
into.
yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised that Mumford would miss some things because he had, his own
Which is
focus.
not
I'm sure he did
Yeah,
it well, but
that's right. He
yeah,
did it very well, and it's not,
yeah,
that's one of the problems in a sense with biography is that unlike a novel where you have a first person narrator, you learn something about the first person narrator. That's very difficult for a
yeah,
biographer to do because people will then start to ask, "Well, I'm not interested in Carl Rollyson, I'm reading about Herman Melville." But I get to the point very,
right.
very early in my so-called meta biography of Melville in which I say, his father died when he was 13. And I've looked at all the biographies, and no one really deals very much with what happened. My father died when I was 13. And so I bring that experience into it. I don't talk a lot about my own experience,
Uh-huh.
but it
You
was obviously a traumatic event. And if you look at, for instance,
sure.
Elizabeth Hardwick's book on Melville, she mentions the father's death and then she goes on to other things, like ho hum.
Mhm, mhm,
So there are
mhm.
moments when I think a biographer
I
has to stop in his tracks or her tracks, so to speak, and say, "Oh, there's a big event here that Melvin himself didn't talk about."
and surely that's the kind of thing that makes a biography interesting, 'cause I wanna ask you about 2 things in particular. The thing we've talked about by email, which is what makes a biography different from a
Yeah,
memoir? And I think this is important because people there's certainly plenty of people writing their own memoirs or family histories, and some would argue, "Well, I know my own story." So they can relate to the
yeah,
famous figure who says, "Well, I'm the only expert on my
that's right.
story." But there's The other question I have, and this is, I think, related, is what makes a biography interesting? So it's not banal, because some biographies are just, and they're sort of just regurgitating. They're just kind of going through endless detail without really providing you with something that makes you wake up and engages you and grips you and pulls you through the story and tells you that it matters. So you obviously have thought about both those questions,
Yes.
and I would love to hear your examples and thoughts.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I was doing my second biography of Lillian Hellman, who had written several memoirs. And an editor, New York editor, actually told my agent, "Well, why do we need a biography? Hellman's already told her told her life." Well, here's an example. I won't use Hellman. I'll use somebody I'm working on now, the actress Eve Arden. I'm writing her biography, even as I'm thinking about Melville, two very different subjects. But unlike
Yeah,
Mel
no
yeah,
kidding.
unlike Melville, Eve Arden did write an autobiography. She did write about almost her whole life because she wrote it late in life, so she covered her whole film
Mhm.
career, radio,
Yep.
TV, etcetera. One of the things she says in her autobiography, for example, right at the beginning, before she actually starts her life story, she says, "Things are left out. I couldn't put in everything." And that's all she says about it. It sort of signals you, that this is my story, but there are things that I won't be writing about. She says it very
'Cause there's no room, or rather to protect the
well, she
innocent
makes
and
it sound like
guilty.
it's just there's just not, in a book you just can't put it all in.
I see.
But here's an example.
Uh-huh.
She was essentially raised by a single mother and an aunt and a grandmother. So what happened to the father?
Mhm.
In the autobiography, Eve Arden says, "My father was a gambler, and after 2 years of marriage, my mother divorced him. First thing I do is go to Ancestry.com to look up the records to see if that's
Uh-huh.
accurate." People reading it probably would say, "Well, of course, and, she would know, right?"
A detail like
Yeah,
that.
it's
Yeah.
not accurate. The mother stayed married to the husband for 6 years, not 2 years, number 1. We don't know, and I still don't know, how much contact Arden had with her father in those 6 years. I do know because she
Mm.
says in her autobiography she deeply resented him because she much admired her mother, who went to work, became a kind of
Mhm.
single mother, and created a millinery business, very successful millinery business. But the point is, so then I'm looking at, fan magazines, which can be highly unreliable. Nevertheless, some of these fan magazine
Yeah.
writers interviewed Eve Arden. And I found an issue of a fan magazine fairly early on in Arden's career in the late 1930s, where she talks about her father saying, "I don't want you to be an actress." Well, that's not in the autobiography. That's really interesting. You see what I'm getting at? There's a
And that was
Yeah,
contemporaneous I
almost,
mean, or at
yeah,
least it was
and the
much
father doesn't die
earlier,
until the
much earlier.
1950s, so he's around a long time.
Yeah,
It's kinda like Joe
yeah.
Craigie, who didn't wanna deal with her father, and she told a biographer, "Oh, he died in World War I." No, he didn't. He didn't he didn't die. He died
I wish.
decades later. Well, Eve Arden is very much the same thing, and the story gets even more interesting because she does mention that her father was a gambler. In fact, her father spent 8 months in prison for embezzlement. He was a post office clerk. That's not in the autobiography. It gets better than that. His father, her father's father, her grandfather, was a gambler and also embezzled almost the same amount of money that his son did. And the grandfather committed suicide. All of this I get from just looking up the records and newspapers.com, stuff like that. None of that is in the autobiography. It raises so many questions about Arden's bond with her mother. Mentioned her mother was a milliner. I flash forward to some fan magazines, and one writer about Arden who's interviewed her says, "Arden has 80 hats." So that's interesting to me. I start looking at Eve Arden's hats in her movies, because at one point she had an argument with the head of Columbia Pictures, who had a hat for her. She said, "No, no, that's not right for the character." She put her foot down. It was Harry Cohn, really tough guy to deal with, and Arden said,
Uh-huh.
"I'm not using that hat in this scene. I got my own hat for that scene." Her I what seems like, sort of interesting but not important, actually, the hats are terribly important in the way she presents herself
Yeah.
to the world on screen and off screen, so that occasionally I'll say things like in a movie where she only has, not a lot to do, but she's playing a kind of
Uh-huh.
feisty Eve Arden character that she's known for. I say, "Well, that's a two-hat role, because in the whole movie, she wears 2 hats. There are other movies where she wears, like, 6 different hats, and there are reasons for that, and so I get into all that kind of
Uh-huh.
stuff. It's just like Faulkner with uniforms. One biographer said, "Why is Faulkner talking about all these uniforms in in his novel, A Fable?" You know, when
Uh-huh.
you do a little work, you see Faulkner loved uniforms. He loved his World War I uniform. When he got married, he paraded around in his uniform. Uniforms tell you something really important about the subject.
Uh-huh.
So those
Mhm.
kinds of things are what at least a biographer like me gets really interested in, what seem like sometimes very trivial details, things that your subject might
Mhm.
mention, might not mention, and they just go on to something else, and you realize, wait a second, something else is going on here.
And might not have been aware of either.
Yes, there are a number of
Depending.
things, there are a
It
number of scenes in Eve Arden's autobiography, and she doesn't seem to understand the implications of those scenes. One of the things she keeps saying is, "I
Mhm.
was really nothing like my on-screen persona. I wasn't that feisty, I wasn't that independent, I didn't come up with the quick one-liners."
Uh-huh.
And then she describes working with the director Gregory LaCava in a film called Stage Door. And she describes,
Mhm.
how he said, "Well, I don't really have a role for you, but stick around the set and you might come up with something." So it's this ensemble set where there's Katharine Hepburn, and a number of
Uh-huh.
other actresses who would become famous, and the director's feeding them lines. He wants to see how they read the lines, and he starts saying these lines,
Mhm.
and he's not getting any response. And Arden, in her autobiography, is describing this, and she says, "Well, if you girls don't know what to do with that line, here it is." And she says it, and everyone laughs. And this happens 2 or 3 times. And I'm thinking as a buyer, and you're telling me you're not anything like your screen persona? That's exactly the kind of thing she does in
Uh-huh.
movies.
Yeah. 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 And that's human,
Yeah.
isn't it? We miss these things, and we forget things, and we smooth out stories.
We telescope
Um
time, we have a certain story to tell, as biographers do. That's why, as I often say, one biography is the answer to another biography. Now that I've reached this advanced old age, I become really interested in that and how biographers use language to tell their stories. One of the people I pick on is Nicholas Del Banco, his big academic reputation, and has written a book on Melville.
Mhm.
And when he gets to the customs inspector time of Melville's life, he says very melodramatically, "And then the darkness descended." And I think, not really. There were aspects to that
Uh,
job in his life in the city that he really liked. That when you say the darkness
uh-huh.
descended, you're really wiping out a whole realm of experience. Sounds good, sounds like a novel, but I don't think it captures what Melville was up to, what he experienced.
Now, have you found that people have in who have written their own stories, that they have seriously misrepresented their lives, and that that's why they were afraid to have a biography written? I mean, in some sense, people, it makes you important if someone wants to write a biography
Yes.
about you, doesn't it?
Yes,
Right?
yes.
But on the other hand, you may have things that I mean, what would be I know you have examples of
Yeah,
this.
biography,
Uh,
when you're doing a biography of someone, if they're living, what you represent to them is a loss of control because they feel they ought to be in control of their own lives, and what right do you're an interloper, you're an intruder. So Susan Sontag loved to tell a story. She told this story at Penn, and it was recorded about how she walked into Farrar, Straus and Giroux knowing nobody, plunked the draft of her first novel on the desk, and that eventually Robert Giroux filched it out of the junk pile and called her in for an interview. And Robert Giroux, the famous editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, was in the Penn audience when Sontag told this story. Almost like a
Uh-huh.
fairy tale story being discovered as a writer by
Yep.
this important
Yep.
Robert Giroux.
Yep.
Robert Giroux wrote her a very
Uh-huh.
funny tongue-in-cheek letter that I found in the Farrar Straus archives at the New York Public Library. He said, "Susan, don't you remember that you came in name-dropping, saying you had talked to Jason Epstein and other people, and they all said this was a novel that I should read?" I mean, it was nothing like the story she told it all. Eve Arden tells a similar story in Autobiography about how she had made a success in a play in high school, and after she graduated, these friends of her mother's took her on a ride, and she said, "It's funny they didn't take my
Uh,
mother. They only took me on this ride to San Francisco." She lived in Mill Valley, about 14 miles outside of San
uh-huh.
Francisco. And they took her into the city, and they dropped her out of at a theater, and they said, "Now you go get a job." And then she tells the story about how with great trepidation, walked into this theater, and Henry Duffy he had his own theater company in San Francisco. Said, "Well, I don't have anything for you right now," but there was something about her evidently that he found attractive, and he wrote to her later and offered her a job in his company. Well, again, you go to one of these fan magazines, and there's an entirely different story where that couple drops out. There's no couple that they talk about how aggressive she was in trying to get into this theater company. I mean, it's a Susan Sontag fable sort of story for Eve Arden too.
Did Susan Sontag respond to the Robert Giroux
No, as far
letter?
as
Do
I
you
know,
have
she
any?
didn't, and I don't think she would have, because what could she say? She wasn't gonna argue with him. She stayed at Fair Strauss and Giroux her whole life. And he wasn't exactly calling her a liar, but he very diplomatically, he would say, "Come on, Susan,
Uh-huh.
this is all fiction. This is not true. This isn't the way things this isn't the way things happen." And that's what biographers are trying to do. This is the way things
Mm.
actually happen. And sometimes they're the way your subject says they did, and often they don't.
Yeah. And some stories become repeated,
Yes.
and the person repeats them, so often that they start to believe that it is so, and then other people repeat it. I certainly have found that with Valerie Eliot. Y that and there's an idea about trust too,
Yes, there is.
isn't
Yeah.
there?
Yeah.
That people will surely know their own
Mhm.
story, and Valerie would tease, drop little things. She did this, she did that with people, and somehow no one questioned it. I worked for her. I never questioned her stories. I mean, I didn't see why she would
It's yeah,
misrepresent.
it's very complex psychologically. E a biographer many biographers, not all of them, but many of them are detectives in a sense. They're
Mhm.
interrogators,
Yeah. Yes,
and
and that, of course, is that is not a banal
and that
biography
that
to
makes
me
people
in any way.
uncomfortable. That makes a lot of people
Yes.
uncomfortable, and I've gotten so suspicious in a sense. Not that my subjects necessarily have hidden motivations, but just that they may not remember correctly. I've been telling a
Yeah.
story. I had been telling it for decades. It goes back to when I was 15 years old in England on a theater tour, and I met James Mason. And I tell people about
Uh-huh.
this, that this gave me this sense of destiny. I was going to be an actor. I said to James Mason, "I'm an actor
Mhm.
too."
Mhm.
And he wanted to see me in a play. Unfortunately, it was the end of the tour, and I was going back home,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
etcetera. And I started in recent years, I started thinking, did that really happen? You know, did it happen the way I said it did? You know, am I, just aggrandizing myself, you
See?
know? You know what happened is somebody from this theater group when I was 15 years old, going back to the year 1963, someone in this a
Uh-huh,
woman read one of my books and she got in touch with me and she was in this theater group. And I said, "I have to ask you, did we really meet?" Because I wasn't alone. I said, "Did we really
mhm.
meet James
Yeah,
Mason?" And she said,
uh-huh,
"Yes." And she said, The way you said it's correct. Y That really did happen." And then she supplied some details that I had entirely forgotten. Which again, that's what
yeah,
biographers do. Even if your subject remembers things, it's not likely that they're gonna remember everything, and yet you might have a letter,
everything.
you may have a friend of the subject, you may have other data which you can put together so that when someone says, "Oh, I read Rollison's biography and so and so, and that's not the person I knew," my answer would be, "Probably not, because there were things about that person you
Mhm.
never knew." I had
Yes.
this big argument with Michael Foote. Jill told him his wife told him that she was born in 1914. She was born in 1911. And the way I found this out was there were her passports. They all said 1911. Her death notice said 1911. I showed him all this, and he still didn't want to believe it. He wanted to believe he was born in 1913. He wanted to believe that he was older than her.
Right, right. That was important, and yeah, the story was fixed. And things do get lodged in people's minds, and they're uncomfortable with something being different. And actually, you remind me that I only began to distrust Valerie Eliot's story. Well, I found a few details that seemed hard to prove and seemed a bit odd. But it was when I was talking to other people who'd known her, and they would start to tell me her story, what they knew about her. And I finally realized that they were telling the story that had been in the newspaper because she had told it. And it was a good story. She actually, created a sort of fairy tale. And it was a good enough story that they simply rattled it off as if they knew it,
Yeah.
and they had been with it for so many years. I couldn't dissuade them of it, even on a detail. There was a woman who'd known her and was certain something had happened, and I said, "But that can't be true," and I would sometimes it was hard with somebody who was in their
Sure.
80s or 90s to correct them
Yeah.
and say, "Well, actually." Remember this one woman having her husband look up some date on her iPad, and it was distressing to her to think that she had been telling this story, believing a story, and I think probably when I left, she went back to the original one, I
Well,
imagine.
yeah, I had the similar experience with Diana Trilling when I was doing my Rebecca West biography, and she
Mhm,
was a good friend of Rebecca West, and she had one son, and Rebecca had one son, Anthony, and Rebecca had terrible problems with Anthony, or as Antony would say, he had terrible problems
mm,
with his mother, and that was
right,
Diana
right.
Trilling's view poor Rebecca, she had all these
Mm,
problems with his son. And then she read a draft of my biography because I sent it
mhm.
to her. I wanted her to look. She had helped me with my Lillian Hellman biography too. My God, she was dismayed at what she learned about Rebecca West. She was so upset because for the first time she saw the son's side of it. Not that the son was absolutely
Mm,
correct or without fault, but simply all she had ever heard was her friend Rebecca's story about this
mhm,
terrible son. And suddenly the terrible son was
mhm,
saying things about the mother that Diana was just really upset about, really upset.
mm. Yeah, and that's hard to see. I mean, it's the job of a biographer, but if you've come to like
Yeah.
someone, I found that distressing
Oh,
myself.
yeah.
And you obviously, I think with Joe Craigie and Michael Foote, that was because you were really very close there. I mean,
Yeah,
I feel as though that obviously you lived in the house with Michael. You sat and drank in the evening with
absolutely. I
Michael. I
picked him up
mean,
in the street when he fell down once. I mean, just all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
right, right. So, that becomes a quite fraught. But and it must be fraught for people who are writing about, some member of their family or someone that they're close to. I mean, how distant do you think a biographer should be? Or how if a biographer is close to someone, how on earth do they keep sufficient
Yeah,
distance?
there's a real, advantage and disadvantage to it, obviously. If it's, for instance, a daughter
Mm,
writing about her father, as, Vincent Price's daughter did, she wrote really a very fine, biography of her father. And
mhm,
Ronald Coleman, another one of my biographical subjects, his
mhm,
daughter wrote a biography. She was born late into his life, so there were many, many things about Ronald Coleman that she didn't know, but she worked like a biographer.
mhm,
She didn't just try to write a memoir. She interviewed a lot of people,
mhm,
and, the problem was when she interviewed people, they're talking about their friend, Ronald Coleman, to his daughter. So there are things that you have to read between the lines and things that I think the daughter didn't pick up. And because the daughter, even though the
mm.
daughter was
Yeah.
working as a biographer, she wasn't a professional biographer. So she let these people sort of go
Mhm,
on. And the good thing about that is that there are long passages in her memoir biography of Ronald Coleman, which give you a real flavor of these people talking about Ronald Coleman. But
mhm,
on the other hand, there's no intervening voice. Again, there's no
mhm.
imperial biographer. There's nobody saying,
Right.
let's stop there for a moment and think about what this person is telling you." So she rarely does that,
Uh-huh.
because it's her dad, and he was a good dad, by the
Yes.
way. There's nothing bad about
Mhm, mhm.
so
Yep.
there's that. I have to mention too, as far as fathers and dads and mothers and daughters go, I was
Uh-huh,
thrilled on YouTube when Eve Arden was going around and there was a TV interview with her. She was, writing her memoir at that point. She hadn't finished. It's called Three
uh-huh,
Phases of Eve. She hadn't finished it
uh-huh.
yet, but she had done a couple films with Joan Crawford and knew Joan Crawford. They were
Mhm.
friends. And at one
Yep.
point, the interviewer, point blank, asked Eve Arden, "Well, what about Christina Crawford's book? It's Mommy Dearest. This is
Mhm,
at the
mhm.
time, and it still is, in a sense, a classic takedown of a
Yep.
Hollywood star, Joan Crawford." And, Eve
Mhm,
Arden just looked at this guy who asked him questions, said, "You know what Christina said's pretty true." She said, "It's true."
mm,
And there is a scene
mhm,
of, Arden adopted 3 children and then had a natural child. She had a child at
uh-huh.
46. She had thought she couldn't conceive, and then in middle age, she did,
Yeah.
have a child. But Joan Crawford was instrumental in Arden's adoption of her first child. So she describes this in
Mhm,
scene without commenting really on it. She describes this scene in which she's put her adopted first child to bed, and Joan Crawford comes over and says, "Oh, I must see the child." And Arden says, "Well, she was having trouble getting to sleep, and I don't
mhm.
want to disturb her," and so on. And Crawford sort of promises, so Crawford, like a star, barges into the room, the child's room, picks it up and starts talking, completely oblivious, virtually confirming the kind of mother Joan Crawford was with her own children. It was really quite amazing. Yeah.
Wow. So you're working on Eve Arden
Yeah.
now and Herman
Yeah, well,
Melville.
what's happened is
This
the Herman Melville book doesn't have a contract. And I have another book also,
Uh-huh,
which I've completed on Sappho, which hasn't been sold yet. So we've got 2
uh-huh,
books that are done. And what happens when a book doesn't have a contract is I don't sit and stew. When is somebody gonna take the Herman Melville? Although it's out to readers now, so I'm there's a good prospect it's
mhm.
gonna be. But anyway, it takes them forever. It's an academic press, and it takes them forever, readers, of
Yes,
course, this, that,
yes,
and the other thing. So I could
yeah.
practically write a book while they're dilly-dallying,
While you're
Yeah.
waiting.
So, that's what I did with Ronald Coleman while I was waiting, for a previous biography to be, accepted by the publisher and so on. I thought, "Well, I'll just write another biography." And, there's a publisher, Bear Manor Media, who did the Ronald Coleman, who I knew I wouldn't even have to do a proposal. I could just say to him, "Here's what I wanna do. Do you want me to do
Uh-huh.
it?" And, let's cut all the rigmarole. Let's just do the book. And so that's what happened with Eve
Yeah.
Arden. I said to him, I said, "Look, I wanna do Eve Arden, and I can get it done
Uh-huh.
in a year or so, and here's how I'm gonna do it." And the whole email was maybe, 300
Uh-huh.
words, and he sent me a contract. So I'm writing about Eve Arden, 30,000 words so far. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent.
And I have a sample
So
chapter of the Melville, and I'm not gonna do any more Melville till I have a
uh-huh.
contract.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to that for various reasons, as you
Yeah.
know. Um, but because of the Mumford connection and there's a local connection, I think Melville is your take on Melville will be of great interest
No,
to me.
thank you.
I wonder what advice you have for someone who is planning to write biography or even planning to write a memoir or write about, I hear from quite a few people who said, "Oh, I'm going to record all my father's or my mother's memories." And I don't think people really grasp the challenge of doing that well. And maybe some people will be happy to just tell the sort of pretty tale that they want to pass their
Yeah.
grandchildren. And that seems and there are or autobiographies published that are like
Mhm.
that. Everything I mean, I know one case where, everything is perfect and great success on all scores, every marriage is ideal and yet I know some of the people involved, and that is not accurate, but that's what that that's sometimes what people want. But other people might want to do something that's more
Mhm.
frank and enlightening. And how can they what questions do you ask? Or if you're a biographer and you want to have a fresh take, do you start with a clear idea, or is it because you're interested in someone, you think they're important? What
For me, and every biographer works differently. Just 2 quick examples.
Uh,
There was a biographer, Frank
uh-huh,
McShane, who spent a whole year compiling a chronology of his subject before he did any serious, writing. That would drive me nuts. I've never done that.
uh-huh,
Uh, I
uh-huh,
might compile a chronology as I do with Sylvia Plath after I've written the biography, but not
uh-huh,
before.
uh-huh,
Um, and
uh-huh,
the other was a British biographer who he would write a first draft of a biography without doing any research. I asked him, "Why do you do that?" And he said, "To find out what I don't know." And that sort of directed his research. It never occurred to me to write a book, and I have not done that either. What I do is, and it's the most important thing, is whether it's true or not, I operate under the illusion that I'm the one to tell the story, that I have a story to tell, and I have to be able to tell that story to myself. It might only be a few sentences. I don't ask myself, "Is there an archive? Will people
uh-huh,
cooperate? Will they talk to me?" I'm kinda like the, guy in the movie who says, "If you make the baseball field, they will come." And this has happened to me over and over again with Walter Brennan, with Lillian Hellman, to name 2 examples, where there were either other biographers or archives were closed or this or that. I couldn't get a hold of the family or so on.
uh-huh,
Didn't matter. In all those cases, I did get access to not the same archive, but to a different archive. And I finally got
uh-huh,
access to, in Brennan's case, to the family through sheer accident, through talking about Amy Lowell of all people. So I proceed that way. First, there's me, and there's the biography and the story I have to
uh-huh,
tell. And after that, everything else is ancillary. How much of an archive, with this, that,
uh-huh,
it will come or it won't. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. but I just have this intuition, frankly, that I can tell the story. And I guess I learned
Mhm.
this early on after my Marilyn Monroe biography. Second biography was Lillian Hellman, and her archive at Texas was closed. It had been open for decades, but it was closed because she had an authorized biographer who never did publish the biography. But it was good enough, and she knew it would be good enough to,
Yeah.
threaten people to make biographers back off.
Yeah.
"Oh, well, there's
Yeah.
somebody authorized, I can't do it." So,
Yeah.
well, I didn't do that. But I remember walking on the street one day,
Mhm.
this was when I was teaching at Wayne State in Detroit, and said to a colleague, the Hellman Archive has just been closed. I sort of had to blurt it out to the world, that this was happening. And two things happened. The poet Richard Wilbur, who did consent to an interview about Lillian Hellman, even though she had told people she had told Wilbur and people like Wilbur, don't talk to any biographers except my authorized biographer. His response was, "Who the hell are you to tell me who to talk to and not talk to?" For some reason, many people did do what, honored Hellman's request. He said, "It's my
Mhm.
experience too. I can talk about it if I want." And he did to me. So that liberated me. And then I thought,
Mhm.
well, this Hellman archive had been open for decades. And there had been a lot of academic research on Hellman. I said, there must be a lot of dissertations with that archive, buried in
Mhm.
the
Yep.
Well, that's what happened. Most of what I wanted in the archive was already in the PhD
Oh,
dissertations anyway.
right. Right. Do you have a conclusion in mind when you start?
Oh, that's
Do
a
you
funny
have
question. Usually no, with one exception.
Mhm.
In 2013, we were approaching 2013, 50th anniversary of Sylvia Plath's death. And I'd always been interested
Mhm.
in Plath, and I had taught Plath going back to the 1970s, and I knew Plath biographers, etc. And most people would have said to me, well, there's not room for another Plath biography. Already, there are too many. But I thought, well, it's the 50th anniversary of her death. Publishers love those 50th anniversary or 100th anniversary, something to
Mhm.
peg it on. And a couple new archives had opened up at British Library, for example. And I thought,
Mhm.
well, it's now or never. So I wrote a proposal.
Mhm.
My agent said, that's great. Well, now you have to take the next step. I said, what's that? She said, sample chat. I said, oh, really, after all the books I've done, I have to do a sample chat? She said, yeah, you have to do a sample chapter. I said, well, what do I do? And she said, well, just, start at the beginning. They just want a writing sample. It's pro forma, et cetera.
Mhm.
I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to write the last chapter. So that's what I did.
Oh.
I wrote because I
Oh.
said, everyone wants to know, it's
Uh-huh.
like Marilyn Monroe. How did she die? Why did she die? What do you make of her death, et cetera?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's gonna
Yeah.
make the book. And anyone who knows I can write the last chapter knows I can write the first chapter. So that's what I did, and that's what sold the book. That's what made it an excerpt in the Boston Globe. Same chapter.
And was it the same chapter in the published book?
Almost the same chapter,
Did
very little
you
difference. And what happened was that I
Mhm.
wrote that book relatively quickly and not much more than a year, and that's because the last chapter gave me momentum. I had something I was
Mhm.
driving toward.
Yeah, I can see that as something that could be really effective, really
Yeah.
helpful. Um,
And I just thought,
and it's probably not so obvious with
yeah.
biography. In fact, a lot of books, a lot of nonfiction books trail off at
To
the
give you one e
they kind
yeah,
of start
that's
at
right.
the
To give you
yeah.
one example of what goes on in that first chapter, there's,
Mhm.
the phone rings, and the phone call's from Asha Wevel, a woman that Hughes was starting an affair with, and Plath sorta knew that,
Mhm.
and she heard this voice on the phone, and even though it was disguised as a man's voice, she was sure that it was the woman that Hughes was having an affair with. And I had this he's dead now, Francis King, a British novelist, who had been very helpful with
Mhm.
my other biographers because he knew a lot of, he knew
Yeah.
Rebecca West, for
He would
example.
know
He would know her.
everyone. Yeah.
But what I
Yeah.
asked him was something quite different. I asked him, "What did a phone sound like in 1963?" Because that's what I wanted to include in the chapter, and he would know because he was old enough to know that.
Mhm.
It's just like the same fellow, Francis King, when I was doing the Joe Craigie's biography, I said, Joe Craigie was a young woman in London between the ages of 18 and 21. In that period, it's a blank in her life. She didn't say, what happened to her other than London was, men followed her on the street. You know, you can imagine a young, beautiful woman being trailed by men, but that's about all I had. And I said, "What novel would you go to give me the sort of the atmosphere of what it was like?" He immediately
Yes.
said,
Yes.
"Elizabeth Bowen, Death of the Heart." And so that's what I deal with in the Creighton
Oh,
family. That's thanks to him.
yeah. Oh, right. Right. Yeah, I've had the same experience of going to novels just to get detail that I can't find elsewhere. I think it's interesting to talk about Sylvia Plath. We've done that before, but I'm thinking about the I can't remember what it was it called Letters Home,
Yeah, her mother's book.
the
Yeah,
collection
collection
of
of letters, yeah.
letters, which was a kind of biography of sort a biography in letters, but it told a story and I assume was designed and put together with the hope of telling Sylvia Plath's story in a particular way.
Yeah, and Ted Hughes gave her a hard
Well,
time.
Sylvia Plath was
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
The mother wanted to show that, there was a closeness between mother and daughter that she wanted to show, but Ted Hughes had to be involved because he controlled the estate, so she couldn't put in everything she wanted, and he was remarried, and his wife didn't like certain things, so it's a very compromised volume. You really have to go to the collected letters
yeah.
to see what the mother left out. It's a problem. By the way, not to be believed, but I have another Plath book coming out.
Oh, rea
It's
what's
called
that?
Searching for Sylvia, at least if they let me keep that title. And it's a
Mhm.
collection of podcasts, essays, some of which have been published, but some not. And I'm still finding out things like Plath and anti-Semitism that I had overlooked in my
Uh-huh.
biographies. The fact that she was steeped in Stoic philosophy, I have an essay on that. So there are a number of things,
Uh-huh.
and dialogues with other Plath biographers, like Heather
Uh-huh.
Clark, for
Uh-huh.
example, and someone who's done a
Uh-huh.
biographical novel of her. So it's originally I had an academic title, Sylvia Plath, Conversations and Critiques, and I thought that's so boring. So now
The search is
searching for Sylvia is a much because that's what I've been doing. Even that'll be my sixth Plath book.
yes.
You know, I don't think there'll be a seventh, but who knows?
I was struck, I'd forgotten this, that Janet Malcolm's book
Silent Woman.
about, uh, is has a most interesting title, and I think I have a copy of it somewhere. I know you've written about that book, which is a kind of, again, a sort of why should people why should there be biographies? Why should people poke and pry? But, why why the title? Sylvia Plath was not a silent
Well, that's
woman.
it. I think it has to do with the fact that she died, suddenly by suicide and could not respond, to all these things that the biographers said about her. That she's
Mhm,
much put upon from Malcolm's point of view, which I have argued more than once is a mistaken
mhm.
point of view. As you say, Plath was anything but silent. She left an incredible record, which after all these books, I'm still, trying to figure out and comment on. She's really a protean figure in so many ways.
Why do you think that the literary people I mean, Janet Malcolm would be one example, Susan Sontag, others who seem to resent
Mhm.
biography? I is there seems to be an attitude towards biography that is is not just dismissive, but positively
Yeah, it's
hostile.
positively hostile. It's the
Is
modernist view of things that it's only the
Mhm,
work that counts. That you shouldn't you it doesn't really tell you anything about the work to know about the person's life. I don't think that's true. But it's like the new criticism, the academic fashion of dealing only with the work,
mhm,
not incorporating elements of sociology or history or other things.
mhm,
It's that they consider biographers leeches like critics. They don't like critics much either most of the time. That
mhm.
and that we're making a lot of money. I wish that were so. I don't even with
Right.
Marilyn Monroe, all them that book is still in print, goes back to 1986. I couldn't support myself for a year on what I've made from that book, not even a year. But they will say that, or people often say, "Oh, maybe you'll get sued," and that doesn't happen. Even if you get sued or threatened to suits, or there are newspaper or magazine articles, if it's a literary figure, it's very unlikely that it's gonna translate into that many sales. It Life does not
Yeah,
work that way. People think it does. Even people in the literary,
yeah.
even these subjects think that, "Oh, Rollison's doing that so he can make a lot of money." That's just
It's
not true.
yeah. How do people respond? Have you heard anything about the response to the revelations about T.S. Eliot? Because if people talk about impersonality and sticking to the work and not to the writer and the life, Eliot is the one always it's always the, impersonality, and yet his letters, over decades show that he was far from being an impersonal writer.
Of course.
Far from far from
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Rebecca West took
Uh,
issue with him at the time, contemporaneously. She didn't think much of
mhm,
his impersonality theory. He compares what happens to a work of art to like a chemical reaction, as if, in a sense, everything about the writer
mhm,
has been used up in the work, and therefore there's no way to go back, to undo the chemical formula, so to speak. And it's a false analogy. That's not what happens,
mhm.
in a work of, at least that's not all that happens, let's put it that way, in a work of art. There are these biographical remnants and trails and things which do help you understand. I like to say I wrote a book called "A Higher Form of Cannibalism: Adventures in the Art and Politics of Biography," and I think it's in that book I make the statement that one of the one of these writers who was very hostile to biography, Alfred Tennyson, said, "Thank
Oh.
goodness," he said, "thank goodness we know almost nothing about Shakespeare. So we can just, enjoy we don't have to, there are no letters, there's no journals, there's nothing. It's just wonderful." And what I say in the book is, if I could meet Tennyson and I said to him, you said this thing about this comment about Shakespeare.
Mhm.
I found this letter of Shakespeare's. It's the first one that's ever been found. Now, I know you don't want to read this letter because it'll spoil your experience of the work, so you're not going to see it. I doubt
Would be
that he would not want to read that letter. Once
yeah,
once you read that letter, biography has hooked you.
yeah, I'm a skeptic. I tend to think that there are other reasons that part of it is that writers who become successful, they do love the adulation that they get. And they don't want anything to mess
Mm,
with the image,
exactly.
the identity, and they want to be able to curate their own image, don't they? So that becomes an issue. So I think biographies, the biographers can do a huge service, even when they're not writing quite as many as you. But I think the thing I'm glad about is you both have written about an incredibly wide range of people, but you've also really explored biography as a craft and really as an art. Because I think that the art is not just in the writing, but in eliciting the information and connecting in pieces of information about people to tell us things that we just wouldn't otherwise have
Yeah.
known. So I very much appreciate that. Great to talk
Yeah,
to you
good to
again.
talk to you too. As you see, once you get me started,
In
I can't stop.
Inspired by Janet
Yeah.
Malcolm.
Take
It's
take
pretty
that,
funny.
Janet Malcolm.
Take that. Yes. All right. Well, I look forward to hearing. Do let me know when the Melville, is what's happening
I
with
will.
that,
Thank
Carl.
you.
Take
You
care.
too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for joining me at The Way We Live Now, where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration. Please leave a comment and subscribe to the newsletter at karenchristensen.substack.com.